I started to believe in evolution when I was in school because, well, that's what they were teaching me. And my belief in evolution grew to be very strong. Let me show you how strong. This book, if I let go of this book, it will fall down. I'm certain of that. Well, that's how certain I was of evolution. I can tell you that there's no one on this planet who is more certain of evolution than I was, because I had no doubts at all. And so when people did not believe in evolution, I thought they're just wrong. So I would try to correct them. I would try to convince them that evolution is true. And if they would not believe, then I would ridicule them. I can remember poking fun at my wife Sandy because she believed in creation. How are we doing with the slides? Oh, there we go. But and so as I said, I even poked fun at my wife. But then one day I found out some things about evolution that bothered me. Not just because there were evidence against evolution, but because I had not been taught them. See, I thought I'd been given both sides of this issue. It turns out I hadn't. And so that raised some red flags. So over the next 3 years, I began an intensive study on this subject. I read many books and probably 100 scientific articles on evolution. And as a result, during that 3-year period, my belief in evolution gradually crumbled and my belief in creation gradually built up. You might say that I gradually evolved into a creationist. Now, just what is evolution that people believe in? You know, when they take a poll, like a Gallup poll, 1 out of 2 Americans will say, I believe in evolution. So what is this evolution that half of America believes in? Well, the best place I know to find out what evolution is from the original source. This book is called The Origin of Species, and it was written by Charles Darwin in 1859. And it was with this book that Darwin first presented his theory of evolution to the world. So let's see in Darwin's own words what evolution is. Therefore, I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed. So according to Darwin, all life on this planet descended from a single form of life that lived long ago. Now, I found the modern version of this in the Buffalo newspaper. Bacteria are the oldest and simplest living creatures and are the common ancestor of all plants and animals. So, according to evolution, all life on this planet, past and present, all life, descended from a single microscopic bacterial cell that lived long ago. That's why I like to call evolution the bacteria to man theory, because that's exactly what evolution says. Evolution says that microscopic bacteria, like you see magnified on this sharp point of a pin, has changed into people. Now there's a handsome young man. Now according to evolution, he came from that. Of course, another way of looking at it is to say that my grandparents, my great-great-great-great-grandparents were bacteria. Of course, evolution says I had a lot of other grandparents between me and Grandpa Bacteria. Actually, if evolution is true, all of you also had grandparents between you and Grandpa Bacteria. If evolution is true, every one of us had grandparents that were rodents, and we had grandparents that were lizards, and we had grandparents that were fish. If evolution is true, then all of us had a whole series of grandparents leading from us all the way back to that great granddaddy of us all, that very first bacterial cell that lived long ago. That is what evolution is. And that's just the grandparents. Remember, evolution says that all life on the planet today is related to us. Let me show you a quote from Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was one of the most famous evolution scientists who ever lived. He was once voted the smartest man in America by the readers of Parade magazine. And let me show you a quote from his book here, what he wrote in his book, The Smartest Man in America. He wrote, an oak tree and I are made of the same stuff. If you go far enough back, we have a common ancestor. And Sagan's right, because if evolution is true, then trees are your relatives. I don't know if you should call them blood relatives, but maybe sap relatives. But as you can see, evolution is all about change. Bacteria change into people and everything else in between. How about creation? Do creationists believe things change? Or do creationists believe that things were created and then just remained unchanged thereafter? Because that's what evolutionists teach about us. They teach that we believe that things do not change over the generations. It makes it easier for them to convince people evolution is true, and I'm going to get into that. But first, let's set the record straight. Do creationists really believe that things don't change over the generations? Let's find out. I'm sure that many of you are creationists, and if you're a creationist, then you believe that everyone in this room descended from the same two peoples. So to find out whether or not creationists believe things change over the generations, I want you to look around the room and see if you can find someone who looks different than you. And if you don't think you look enough different than the person next to you, compare yourself to a person of a different race. You see, creationists have always believed that all people, all races, descended from the same two people. So of course creationists believe things change over the generations, contrary to what evolutionists are teaching about us. Actually, truth be known, creationists believe that things changed over generations long before the theory of evolution was ever invented by man. Let me show you a picture I took of some change that creationists believe. This is a picture of our three sons. Now, as some of you know, they're a bit older now, but even at this young age, our boys look quite a bit different from each other. But how can that be? They each have the same mom and dad, so shouldn't they look identical to each other? Why don't they? Well, one possibility is these boys of ours are mutants. You know, Sandy and I have talked about this, and we don't think our boys are mutants. I'm going to be speaking a bit about mutations in just a little while here. But the reason these boys look different from each other is because when they got their genes, you know the genes that are in our DNA? When they got their genes from Sandy and me, half from each of us, they each got our genes shuffled up in different ways. You see, creationists believe that each one of us has a huge number of genes in our DNA, and that these genes can be shuffled up in a huge number of ways, which allows for a huge amount of change to take place within our kind. But the important thing to remember is every gene, every individual gene in these boys' DNA can also be found in my DNA or in Sandy's DNA. So you see, there's no new genes here. It's the same old genes shuffled up in different ways. And just like there's a limit to how many ways you can shuffle a deck of cards, right? There's not an infinite number of ways to shuffle a deck of cards. So just like there's a limit to how many ways you can shuffle a deck of cards, there has to be a limit to how many ways you can shuffle the genes. Therefore, there has to be a limit to how much change you can get by shuffling the genes. Let me show you another picture I took. Would you believe that these two dogs are both full grown? But look at the difference. Now, Buster is a full-grown boxer belonging to a friend, and Augie, full-grown Chihuahua, belonged to my sister. Now, do you think that creationists believe that these two dogs, even though they're so different, share common ancestors? Well, let's find out. According to creationists, how many dogs got on Noah's Ark? 2. According to creationists, how many dogs got off Noah's Ark? 2. Or more. I guess we don't know how many got off the ark because they were on the ark for just over a year. But we do know that only, according to creationists at least, only 2 dogs got on the ark, which means that according to creationists, all the dogs in the world today descended from just 2 dogs that got on the ark. What does that prove? Well, that proves that creationists have always believed in a tremendous amount of change accumulating over the generations, contrary to what evolutionists are teaching. Look at the change you can see just in the single picture I took. You got a small dog and a big dog. That's quite a change. But there's more than just the size difference. Look, there's pointed snout, flat snout, long fur, short fur, pointed ears, floppy ears, red bow, no red bow. Okay, forget the red bow. Because as you know, red bows have nothing to do with genetics. But all those other changes I mentioned are genetic changes. And there's many other genetic changes that are not so evident from the picture. The point is, this single picture proves that creationists have always believed in a tremendous amount of change accumulating over the generations, contrary to what evolutionists teach about us. So today, we have over 300 varieties of dogs. And they come in all shapes and sizes and colors and temperaments, but all of them descended from just 2 dogs according to creationists. So the creation theory goes like this. God created different kinds of plants and animals, and then he gave each kind the genetic ability to change. Why? So they could adapt to different environments. But the potential for change is small compared to what evolutionists believe. Small. Now, you've just heard me say creationists believe in a tremendous amount of change. Well, they do, but it's still small compared to what evolutionists believe. Remember, evolutionists believe that bacteria have changed into people. Creationists don't believe anything of the sort. So to compare the two theories, there we go. To compare the two theories, when you look at grandparents of the past, evolution says that some of our grandparents of the past included rodents, lizards, and fish. But creation says, no, all our grandparents of the past were people. No matter how far back you go, every one of our grandparents was a person. And when you look at cousins, evolution says that some of our cousins that are alive on the earth today are things like trees, grasshoppers, and snails. But creation says, no, all our cousins today are people. No matter how distant related they are, every one of our cousins today is a person. Now, I have to tell you, to believe in evolution, you have to be taught evolution. And I mean really taught, because otherwise you'd never believe it. Let me illustrate this. When our youngest son was 3 years old, I had recently become a creationist. I had recently given up on the theory of evolution. And so I thought, well, Troy's 3 years old. It's time he learns some evolution before he learns it someplace else wrong. Or in this way, I can teach him both sides of it, unlike how I was taught. So I was tucking him in bed one night. I thought, well, this is a good time. And so I said, Troy, I want to tell you that Daddy used to believe in evolution. And that 3-year-old from his pillow looks up at me and says, Daddy, what's evolution? Good question. And I said, well, you know how I'm your daddy, but do you know who my daddy is? And he said, Grandpa. And I said, that's right, but do you know who Grandpa's daddy was? And he thinks, and so I helped him. I said, well, Grandpa's daddy died a long time ago, but Grandpa had a daddy. Everybody has a daddy. So Grandpa had a daddy, and Grandpa's daddy had a daddy, and his daddy had a daddy, and his daddy had a daddy. So I kind of took Troy back through time, so you could see the grandpas just keep going back. And then I said to him, well, Troy, when I believed in evolution, I believed that if you go back enough daddies, some of those daddies were fish. And he gets this horrible look of confusion on his face, and I think, what have I done? But then suddenly that look turned to a great big smile. And that 3-year-old from his pillow looks up at me with that grin and says, Daddy is joking. You know, you can take a 3-year-old and teach him that Santa Claus is going to go down every chimney in the world in one night, and he'll believe it. Or you can teach him that come March or April, a large rabbit's going to sneak in the house and hide colored eggs all over the place, and he'll believe it. But try to teach him evolution. Not so easy. Which brings us to this question. How do schools convince students that evolution is true? Well, I can answer this one from experience because the schools did a really good job with me, and they do a really good job with millions of other students. You see, they employ a strategy, and the strategy goes like this. First, they try to convince the students that only evolutionists believe things change. In other words, they teach them that creationists believe things don't change. They're just created and remain the same thereafter. And then, once they can convince students that only evolutionists believe in change, they can convince them of that, then they got them. They got them, because then all they have to do is present any example of change, no matter how small, as evidence of evolution. Now, I'm going to show you some examples where this strategy is employed. Over here, I have a pile of textbooks that have been used in our schools. I took them from my collection at home. And I'm going to show you a quote from each one of these books where this strategy is employed. One of the books, by the way, is a book that I was required to use in a course that I took in college. Another is a book that my sister was required to use in college. Another is a book that my coworker was required to use in college. And one of them, by the way, is a book that our oldest son used in 7th grade science class at Allegheny Limestone Central School, just up the road from here. I'm going to show you a quote from each one of these books where the evolution scientist who authored the book is trying to convince the students that creationists believe things do not change. Okay, first book. Creationists believe that each species of plant and animal was created separately and remained unchanged thereafter. Is that what creationists believe? No! Creationists don't believe that. Creationists never believe that. If that was true, every one of you would look like either Adam or Eve, and all dogs would look alike. That's not what creationists believe. Creationists never believe that. Remember, creationists believe things changed over generations before evolution was even invented. That's misleading. That's a lie. But it's all part of their strategy. Next book. Creationists believe that all modern organisms are essentially unchanged descendants of their created ancestors. False. That's not what creationists believe. Creationists believe in unchanging forms of life individually made by the Creator. False. Creationists believe that living things didn't change through time. False. Creationists believe that each species was separately created and once formed did not change from one generation to the next. False, false, false. That is not what creationists believe. Creationists never believed that. Creationists believed in change before evolution was invented. So how do they get away with saying this honesty, this lie? Well, it's all part of their strategy. Convince students that only evolutionists believe in change, then they can present any example of change, no matter how small, as evidence of evolution. So the books are just packed full of all these little examples of change that are supposed to be evidence for evolution. Very convincing. And I want to tell you, it's not just in the textbook that this strategy, this dishonest strategy is employed. Here's a popular weekly news magazine, U.S. News and World Report. In this issue, there's an article about fruit flies. The title of the article is Darwin as Fit as Ever, and the subtitle is Evolution in Action. In this article, they claim to have documented an actual example of evolution taking place in nature. Now, what could be better evidence of evolution than that? A documented example of evolution taking place. So let's take a look at this big example of evolution that's supposed to be so strong of evidence. Now, let's make sure it's a big change because, obviously, if it's just a change that both creationists and evolutionists believe in, then it wouldn't be evidence for either theory. So let's see what this huge change in these fruit flies are. Let's see if they changed into a robin or a wasp or a bumblebee or something. Let's see what they changed into. School boards and politicians may have their doubts about the theory of evolution, but out in the natural world, Darwin keeps winning hands down. Fruit flies have evolved the pattern of size differences. Flies at the northern end of the range have wings about 4% longer than those in the south. Wow, that's quite a change. 4%. A whopping 4%. Certainly creationists would never believe that something could change in size by 4%, would they? Ladies and gentlemen, if creationists believe that dogs have changed this much through selection, and creationists do believe that dogs have changed this much through selection, then don't you think that creationists would believe that wings on a fruit fly could change by measly 4%? My question would be, why would the editors of this magazine print such a ridiculous article? Well, I asked the question, but I think I know the answer. I have little doubt that the editors of this magazine went through the same type of schools that I went through and were taught the same type of rubbish that I was taught, that only evolutionists believe things change. Therefore, when they had that article presented to them, they probably thought, wow, a change. That's evolution. Let's print it. When I first read this article, it got me thinking about my feet. I know it sounds silly, but I wear a size 12 shoes. But guess what? My dad, he only wears size 9. You know what that means? That means that in a single generation, Miller's feet have gone from size 9 to size 12. That's a whole lot more than a 4% change. Do you suppose the editors of this magazine would be willing to print an article about the evolution of Miller's feet? Probably not. What causes dogs and other living things to accumulate variations? I mean, you see how different dogs are. They certainly didn't get like that in one generation. Somehow, after the genes get shuffled and cause these little variations, somehow certain variations have to be selected out and saved so they can accumulate over future generations. So that process, by the way those little variations are selected out, is what we call selection. And actually, we break it down into two types of selection: artificial selection and natural selection. But they're really the same thing, because the genes get shuffled, then you just select out the certain variations and save them. But with artificial selection, people do the selecting of the variations, and natural selection, nature selects the variations. Now, artificial selection, you probably know that better as selective breeding. It's done all the time. That's why a lot of our vegetables look so big and plump, and fruits and so forth. And that's why if you go down Walmart, look at the tropical fish, you'll see how big and colorful they are. They're through selection. A lot of times right in people's basements. I've known two people, they practice selection on fish and get them to be the shape, size, and color they want, and then sell them to fish stores. Selective breeding is real easy to do, and all you're doing is, the genes get shuffled, causing little variations. You just save the variations you want and get them to accumulate. It's done all the time. Another example would be dogs. How do you think we got dogs to be so big and so small? People wanted big dogs, so they got a bunch of dogs together and selected out the biggest ones, bred them. They got a little bit bigger, selected out the biggest ones, just kept doing that. They got them to be as big as a St. Bernard or even bigger. But you know what? No one's ever been able to get dogs to be as big as an elephant. Why not? Elephants can get that big. Why can't dogs? Because elephants have the DNA necessary to get that big. Dogs don't. No matter how much you shuffle up dogs' genes, you won't get dogs to be as big as an elephant, because what you need is not there. Same thing. If you want dogs to get real small, and somebody did, they kept selecting the smallest dogs until they got them to be as small as a Chihuahua or even smaller. But they never got them to be as small as a mouse. Why not? Mice can get that small. Same reason. Mice have the DNA to get that small. Dogs don't. And no amount of shuffling the genes is going to get it for you. So anyway, that's artificial selection, where people select out the variations and save them. Natural selection does the same thing, except nature. Now, the best way I can explain natural selection is give a hypothetical example. Let's say you have two deer grazing in a field. And now the nearby woods comes a hungry predator. He wants to catch one of the deer and eat it for supper. So the predator starts chasing after the deer, and the deer take off running. But eventually, the predator catches up to one of the deer and kills it. Now, which deer gets killed, the faster deer or the slower deer? The slower deer. And which deer gets away? The faster deer. Now, what does that mean for the deer population as a whole? What it means is the fast deer, just because she was fast, got away, and could therefore go on to have more kids, and therefore pass on her fast variation into the deer population. How about the slow deer? Can she pass on her slow variation? No. Oh no, she's dead. Her slow variation stops right there. That's why you never see any slow deer out there. It really is, because for deer, being fast is an advantage. Therefore, selection is always selecting out the fast variation and saving it into the deer population. So there you have the two selection processes. Identical, genes get shuffled, causing little variations, and then selection selects out certain variations and saves them so they can accumulate over future generations. Now, since both creation and evolution teach that selection accumulates changes over time, what is the difference between the two theories? Well, I think you know. Evolution says those variations will just keep coming forever. Therefore, selection can just keep accumulating them forever and change fish into people or anything else. But creation says, no, there's a limit to how many variations can come, because there's a limit to how many ways you can shuffle the genes, which is what's causing the variations to occur in the first place. So you can't change fish into people. Now, when you look at a litter of puppies, you will see variations among them. Why are there variations? Well, I think everybody knows why there's variations. It's because each puppy got a different shuffle of the genes from mom and dad. But back in 1859, when Darwin wrote his book, nobody knew. They didn't know what genes were. Darwin had no idea what caused variations. He saw the variations in a litter of puppies, but he had no idea why they were different from each other. He admits it in his book. Let me show you. I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if the variations had been due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation. But even though Darwin admittedly had no idea what caused variations to occur, he nevertheless assumed, he made the huge assumption that there is no limit to those variations. Let me show you. Slow though the process of natural selection may be, if feeble man can do so much by his powers of artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change which may be effected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection. So, what was Darwin's big assumption? That there's no limit to change. The variations will just keep coming forever and ever, and selection can just keep accumulating them forever and ever and change fish into people or anything else. And that's what he believed. Question, which theory does the evidence support? Does the evidence support limited change like creationists believe, or does it support unlimited change like evolutionists believe? And this is the question I've been building up to. Let's start with Luther Burbank. Luther Burbank was known as the greatest selective breeder of plants of all time. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Burbank developed over 800 new types of plants, including 113 new types of plums. Hey, if anybody knew their plums, it was Luther Burbank. If anyone knew the amount of change you could get through selection, or if there's any limit to the amount of change you get through selection, it was Luther Burbank. He devoted his life trying to change things through selection. And look what he says in this book. I know from my experience that I can develop a plum 1/2 inch long or one 2.5 inches long with every possible length in between. But I am willing to admit that it is hopeless to try to get a plum the size of a small pea or one as big as a grapefruit. In short, there are limits to developments possible. Limits. This man who devoted his entire life trying to change things through selection says one thing he found out through his life's work is that there's a limit to how much change you can accumulate with selection. He even goes so far as to say it is hopeless to try to go beyond the limits of change. Now, why is it hopeless to go beyond the limits of change? Because there's only so many ways you can shuffle the genes, which is what's causing the variations to occur in the first place. So of course it's hopeless to go beyond the limits of change. But I don't think you need Luther Burbank to tell you that. You could find out yourself. You could practice selection on something. People do it all the time with different things. And see if you practice selection on something, see if you can get something to change into something totally new. Good luck with that. Or talk to a farmer who's worked in plants and animals his entire life, see what he thinks. Or talk to someone skilled in horticulture, or someone that's been trained in animal husbandry. See if they know of any example, any place, where anyone has ever succeeded in getting one organism to change into another. Ladies and gentlemen, no matter what you try, where you look, who you talk to, you will not find a single example anywhere, any place where anyone has ever succeeded in getting one organism to change into another. It simply has not happened. So the evidence is very, very clear. It's a slam dunk. The evidence supports limited change. It does not support and never has supported unlimited change. But you might be wondering, well, how about lab experiments? After all, when scientists come up with a new theory, don't they run the laboratory and design fancy experiments to try to test the theory, to try to prove the theory correct? Absolutely. And that's exactly what they did with evolution. Ever since Darwin came up with his theory 153 years ago, scientists have been busy in the laboratory trying to prove evolution true, trying to prove that one organism can indeed change into another organism. And every experiment over that 153 years has failed to do so. But you know, after about 50 years of that, they started to wise up. They said, hey, this isn't working. Darwin promised us that one organism could change into another, but our experiments are not bearing it out. So they got to think, we got to come up with something different. So they came up with this idea about mutations. Mutations, first of all, what are mutations? They're simply copy mistakes in the DNA. You know, when one generation makes copies of its DNA to pass on to the next generation, if they make a copy mistake in that DNA, it's called a mutation. That's all it is. But anyway, evolution scientists theorized that somehow copy mistakes could generate all the highly complex information to change bacteria into people. In other words, what they theorized was that we are the current end products of billions and billions of mistakes. And so they got busy in the laboratory to try to prove this theory. They conducted mutation experiments. For 100 years, they've been doing mutation experiments. They usually use fruit flies because they have a short gestation period, about 12 days. That way they can get a quick turnaround in their experiments. In an effort to get fruit flies to mutate, they've hit them with radiation, chemicals, heat, pressure, anything they can think of to get fruit flies to mutate. And in that respect, they've been very successful. They have succeeded in getting millions of fruit flies to mutate in the laboratory. Of course, through all that, what have they gotten those fruit flies to mutate into? Fruit flies. You know, through 100 years of experiments, even when they combine it with selection, so they have selection plus mutations, 100 years of experiments, they haven't even gotten fruit flies to change into a housefly. Just fruit flies. All they've proven through 100 years of experiments of mutations plus selection is that fruit flies can evolve into fruit flies. And they haven't even gotten a better fruit flies. Think about that. 100 years of experiments with mutations plus selection, and they haven't even gotten a better fruit fly. So as you can see, mutations, in spite of all the hype, have not helped evolution in the least. Here's the facts. The facts are no experiment with selection mutations has ever produced more than a relatively small amount of change, which is exactly what the creation theory predicts. And in spite of millions of attempts over many decades by thousands of scientists, no one has ever succeeded in changing one organism into another. Those are the facts. So if you're going to believe in evolution, then you're just going to have to believe in it because the facts do not support evolution. Can we have both? I often get asked that. I get asked, Chris, can't we believe in both the Bible and evolution? After all you have to do is go to the Bible and pull out a couple of pages maybe and change several other things throughout Scripture. And then we can all get along and be happy. Well, no, you can't have both. Not if you're going to be logical about it because they contradict each other in many ways. Let me just show you a couple ways. Evolution says that animals evolved into existence and then they roamed the earth for millions of years until finally the first bird evolved into existence. So animals first and then birds. That's not what God says. God says He created birds before any of the animals. So that means that evolution and the Bible contradict each other. You can't have both. And where does God say this? On the first page of His Word. Isn't that cool? God destroys the theory of evolution with the first page of His Word. Let me show you another example. Evolution says that there was life in the sea for 3 billion years before the first tree ever evolved into existence. That's not what God says. God says He made trees before He made any of the life in the sea. And where does He say that? Also on the first page. You know, they say that you should not judge a book by its cover. And that's true. But you can judge a book by its first page. Because if you are convinced that there's mistakes all over the first page, how are you going to believe anything in the rest of the book? And that's where I was. Because I had no doubts at all about evolution. I believed it as much as anything. I believed it like gravity. And so when I saw that evolution contradicted the first page of the Bible in several ways, I couldn't trust anything in the rest of the Bible. But then when I eventually found out that evolution was a false theory, I had to go back to God. And I said, God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I trusted the word of the smartest people in the world instead of the word of the all-knowing God. And I said, I'm sorry, God. I told God I would never doubt His word again. So today, I believe in the entire Word of God. You know, we don't have a right to change anything in the Word of God because we were created. He is our creator. How can the created change the word of the creator? How complex is life? Well, it turns out it's just mind-boggling how complex it is. I can tell you with certainty that even the simplest of life on this planet is by far more complex than anything the mind of man has ever developed, by far. You know, when you look at a simple form of life like the bacterial cell, if you look at it with a regular microscope, it doesn't look so complex. It just looks like a dot. But today, with electron microscopes that can magnify millions of times, we're able to magnify that dot, and what we find out is it's not so simple. It's a city. It's a thriving city. And that's not my analogy, by the way. Evolution scientists quite often do that. They quite often compare the bacterial cell to a city complete with factories, many factories, each one pumping out thousands of products every second. And then transportation systems that move those products around to where they can be utilized. And inlets and outlets that only let certain things in and only let certain things out. And just a whole bunch of other processes going on simultaneously all over that city. Just a bustling city. And all that, by the way, requires power. Where do you suppose a bacterial cell gets all the power it needs to run all its factories and transportation system and everything else? Power plants. Each bacterial cell has power plants in it to generate the power it needs to run the city. It's just mind-boggling. Now compare that to a human city. You know, a human city has factories too. But you know what? In a human city, every factory has a team of foremen telling its workers what to do. But in this city, there's no foremen to tell the workers what to do. In fact, there's no workers. The whole city, everything, every factory, everything in there all runs by itself, automatically. And you know what else? This city can duplicate itself, make an entire copy of itself. You know how long that takes? 20 minutes. 20 minutes to make a copy of a bustling city complete with all its factories, by far more complex than a human city, makes an entire duplicate copy in 20 minutes. It's enough to put you to your knees. What do evolution scientists say about this? Let me show you an example. Because remember, evolution scientists, they believe that this all came together by chance. They believe the first bacterial cell, with all its millions and millions of component atoms that make it up, they just all go, whoop, this all came together just right to make the first bacterial cell operate. What do they say? Well, Dr. Duvet, Christian Duvet, microbiologist, he's an evolutionist. He believes it all came together by chance. And he was a Nobel Prize winner. In other words, by this world's standards, he's one of the wisest people in the world because he's a Nobel Prize winner. And look what he says. He says, you know, if you equate the probability of the birth of a bacterial cell to that of the chance assemblies of component atoms, even eternity will not suffice to produce one for you. What's he saying? He says it's impossible to happen by chance. He says even if you have eternity, it's not enough time for it to happen by chance. But then look what he says. So you might as well accept, as do most scientists, that the process was completed in no more than 1 billion years. Just accept it. He just got done saying it's impossible. But now he says, just accept it. Why? Because we don't have a choice. If life did not start by chance, how else could it have started? And he was asked in the same interview, Dr. Duvet, do you think that maybe God had some role in the beginning of life? And here's how he answered. Quote, the answer of modern molecular biology to this much debated question is categorical. Chance and chance alone did it all from primeval soup to to man. That's from one of the wisest people in the world. You know what the Bible says about the wisdom of this world? It's foolishness. 1 Corinthians, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. Let me close with Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. See what this says? This says that the power of God is obvious, clearly seen, obvious to us. And why is the power of God obvious to us? Because of what has been made. The creation. The creation. That's why it's obvious to us. Just look at a little seed. Take some dirt and change that dirt into a beautiful flower. Or look up in the heavens at night at the stars. Or look at the face of a newborn baby. The entire creation screams God. And this says if we still don't believe, after looking at the creation, we still don't believe in God, then it says we have no excuse. That's how obvious it is. And I'm sorry. I'm really sorry it took me so long to get this. I'm sorry it took me so long to give my Creator credit for his creation. And I'm also sorry for anyone in my past who I persuaded to believe in evolution. That was wrong of me.